Yeah, so I'm a professor at UCI. I am an art historian. I actually work on medieval art, particularly the Byzantine Empire. But I've been very interested in spaces that unsettle our traditional ideas of time and space, particularly any form of themed entertainment. So I taught a graduate seminar several years back about Las Vegas and different forms of themed spaces. And there was one class on Disneyland. I decided to teach this as an undergraduate seminar, and it just became about Disneyland. And that has sort of continued to grow according to my own interests as I'm sort of picking a new project that I'm working on. So I've begun to do some research on Disneyland, particularly understanding the fact that when I'm interested in Disneyland, I'm interested in the creative processes, not just in the visual arts that are there, but also in the technology that goes behind it. And so my class on Disneyland, which I'll be teaching as a large lecture for the first time in the spring, is actually, I'm very proud of this. It actually counts for arts and humanities general education requirements, but also science and technology, which means that they can take my class instead of chemistry or biology. I'm sorry. Which means that I take this class very seriously, and it's probably not as fun as my students would like it to be. But it is essentially a history of the art and design of Disneyland with an understanding of the technology required to produce these spaces. So students will be reading through patents, learning the basics about industrial manufacturing and other methods that are found at Disneyland. So I sort of want to reflect a little bit on my teaching and how I approach these issues in the time I have with you today, and then I'm open for questions at the end of this. But I wanted to begin with this image comparison, which I tend to begin my Disneyland classes with, which is essentially to throw this out to the audience and just ask, what are we looking at in these two images? What are the differences? Think about color, composition, etc. And I'm going to turn this a little bit on you. Give you a few seconds to look at it. So what is most striking on, let's start with the image on the left. What, if you had to place it, how many of you are familiar with Disneyland? Okay, great. So we have familiarity with the space. If you had to place the image on the left, for example, somewhere in the park, where would you place it? Cars. Let's stick to Disneyland Park alone. Good, Frontierland. Thunder Mountain. Oh, I like Countertop at Main Street. Why Countertop? Okay, great. So looks kind of marble, definitely. I like Frontierland. This is actually a bathroom stall in Critter Country under the Hungry Bear restaurant. But I like Frontierland. My students always, first thing out of their mouths is Frontierland or Splash Mountain, and which I love because that's absolutely correct with the color palettes of the sort of muddy ochres and browns and reds very much creates something that you can attribute usually to these certain types of lands, which of course Cars Land uses a very similar color palette. It also says so much about sanitary surfaces and bathrooms, our expectations of marbles. I can always insert a reference to the Kardashians and their obsessions with different types of marbles. And of course, can anyone guess the image on the right where it might be? Might be pretty obvious. Matterhorn is great. It's actually from the castle. Here's a close-up, and that is that image. It is actually from a wall of the castle, previous paint job. But the Matterhorn is actually a great example because of the fact that really this type of painting technique was perfected on the Matterhorn to produce this illusion of stone. What you basically have here is a base glossy layer of paint and then paintbrushes dipped in different colors and speckled on the surface to create this texture that sort of catches the light and reflects that light back to create this illusion of stone. when they were actually doing the Matterhorn as well, they also used retroreflective paint for the snow. And if anyone knows what retroreflective paint is, it's basically what all of our lane dividers are made out of, where you basically put a base layer of white or yellow paint, and then you pour these micro beads of glass on there so that it reflects the light, catching the light from incoming light so that it would really have the effect of snow glistening when the sun hit it. So these various methods, of course, are great to compare because the bathroom stall example is a form of theming that we have in many of our bathrooms and that we take for granted. This idea that perhaps bathrooms should have marble, we should have a surface with a lot of patterning to avoid any stains, etc. And here you have a similar type of theming for very different effects, basically to conjure up the idea that you have a masonry wall that's been formed from individual blocks of stone. And so this is the first step in any of my classes as an art historian, which is just getting students to describe, to tell me what they're looking at without making any judgments as to what it is. What students really want to tell you what everything symbolizes immediately. And I'm like, not how I work as an art historian. And so for me, these are the first steps that I begin with any class that I teach, and particularly Disneyland. So now I want to run through some of the stereotypes of what you would think I would be doing when thinking about Disneyland as an art historian. And of course, the first one is, I think a lot of students expect me to pick out every work of art and every citation in the park and tell them what it means, which I will point out if it is necessary or important. But one of those key things is, for example, here in the courtyard of the Haunted Mansion, where you have a bust of Michelangelo's David just hanging out, not really important. These are sort of, these are the moments where you realize Imagineering is not custom making everything in the world, but rather picking these out from probably your garden ornament shop across the corner in Burbank. And this is also an important site for me because then we have this work of art, which of course, to most looking at it might seem like another one of these generic garden ornaments. I particularly recognize this as a personification of winter by this French 18th century artist. And what I like about this sculpture is that it really pushes against what students expect about creativity and genius, because it is a sculpture that, of course, is not only cast, so that means it can be reproduced multiple times, but it is also a sculpture that when you look closely at it, clearly is being cited, but there is something different, particularly that urn beside it, which changes the idea that this is an exact copy of this particular work. In fact, it is a copy of copies of this work, as this version done in marble, where since the use of marble, it required an extra appendage to sustain the weight of that marble, unlike the bronze. And so that urn is added essentially for that support. These tend to be things that I see immediately as an art historian, but that my students might not. And what I'm interested in doing is understanding, what is this sculpture doing? Of course, it's not being picked for the courtyard of the Haunted Mansion because of this rich history of copying and alteration, which I think works very well in Disneyland, but because of the fact that, of course, it conjures up this idea of spookiness, for lack of a better term, or critical language to describe it. And it really embodies some of the themes that the Haunted Mansion is trying to achieve. This is in particular in a sort of forgotten space, which is sort of the greenhouse area of the Haunted Mansion, where you essentially make your hard copy fast pass reservations. But a lot of this type of close looking also allows students to understand, well, what are these textures like the wall coverings, these textures of stone, or is it marble? Here I'm giving you a comparison just to make it clear that, of course, the gargoyle-esque candelabra in the stretching room of the Haunted Mansion are meant to convey bronze. And by looking closely at works of art, we can, of course, understand the way that the green patina of bronze is being communicated on the work on the right, with that brown and green, very subdued, really capturing a sense of the material that is being communicated here when, of course, these candelabras are not made out of actual bronze. So that type of critical visual language really helps students begin to have the vocabulary, first of all, to begin to analyze these spaces, to begin to deconstruct them, and to understand just what we are looking at and what those layers of meaning are. I particularly will, just to stay in the same stretching room, I can even bring this comparison when, of course, I'm showing you this not for the formal similarities, but rather for the fact that the Pantheon in Rome, in order to heighten the size of the dome, actually foreshortens, or rather uses forced perspective to create those coffers on the ceiling going up on the dome, smaller and smaller, to make it look as if the dome is actually higher pitched than it actually is. A very similar effect, perhaps less effective on the left, with the screen that is supposed to cover up the top of the stretching room. So with visual vocabularies that I teach in every art history course, I very much think that my students can become better, how should I say this, art historians of Disneyland, but also on a very basic level, better fans. And a lot of what I try to do in my classes is to make art historical methods less intimidating, to show them that these types of visual analyses are not only found in an art history class, but you might find it on YouTube when you're watching, I don't know, a deconstruction of a Star Wars trailer where they're trying to piece everything into some broader universe. That type of comparative looking and cross-analysis is something that is surprisingly a part of popular culture more and more. And so a lot of what I also do in my class beyond that is then adding the historical component to all this, scaling up from those ideas to think a little bit about the history of rides at the park. I'm showing you here layouts of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride and Snow White. One fun fact about these various rides at park opening, they were very unsuccessful because they decided that you would be the main character. So the main characters would not be represented in the entire ride. And Snow White in particular had a very troubled history. Famously, a grandfather got off the ride and said, "What the hell was that? We were screaming the whole time, and where the hell was Snow White?" Because of the fact that you were Snow White, and it was terrifying because the witch just kept attacking you. The queen kept attacking you the entire time, which is why it got rethemed as Snow White's Scary Ride and Adventure over the years. But a little bit of what I'm doing here is also showing you a pattern from the early 20th century to demonstrate that, of course, these type of ride systems and experiences were not unique to Disneyland by any means. You have here this wonderful pattern that really shows you the patenting of what we call dark rides, with the idea that you enter a loading dock, you then go into these doors that keep the light out of the space, and then you go through a series of scenes that are activated by essentially just a mechanical arm on the side of the track that the car bumps into and activates the various show effects. This, of course, happens in Snow White. The only thing that those mechanical actuators are now optical limit switches, and the technology is basically the same except some minor upgrades. And so understanding that lack of originality, rather, that history of repurposing that Disneyland has, is a very useful way of understanding that other things like the submarine ride had pre-existing patents dating to the 30s that Disney looked at, reused when they patented their own rides as well. So we have very clear public documentation of these chains of creative repurposing. One of the things that Disney Imagineering does very well is looking at consuming information voraciously and seeing how could they apply this in new and creative means. My personal favorite is Peter Pan's ride, which if you've ever been on Peter Pan, you've been on a conveyor system. You have been on a warehouse conveyor system that is used to transport goods in the process of manufacturing. And I particularly love this because I can imagine Imagineers thinking, what do we do for this ride? How do we make people fly? And just sitting in a warehouse looking up and saying, that's our answer. So they actually use the Cleveland Tram Rail company, which still to this day, they use the same track, just rebranded over the years, which was basically producing these various conveyors to carry heavy loads, particularly for the manufacturing of airplanes, and basically any warehouse application you could imagine, from bakeries to iron smelting and so forth. And so this type of history of looking at pre-existing technology and applying it also leads us to some of Disney's most creative new ideas, Particularly, one of my favorites is the Omnimover system, which if you've ridden Haunted Mansion, you're familiar with. Here I'm showing you its first iteration with Adventures Through Inner Space from 1967, where you have essentially a roller coaster track under the ground, very much learning the lessons of what they did for the Matterhorn, and essentially conveying all the ride vehicles at once. So you have a constant moving of people with two other tracks on the sides that actually move the way in which the cars look. And what I love about the Omnimover vehicles is how they really restrict vision. They're very much instruments of looking that direct you to certain scenes at particular moments and really help restrict your vision from anything else. So it's this wonderful translation of what Disney Studios was doing in a more filmic capacity into three-dimensional space. As an art historian, I'm thinking about museums and how difficult it is for people to follow a line in a museum, and there's so much freedom. Disney, I feel, really captured this idea of how do we get people to look at certain things, limit their vision, and really have a better control over the narrative that people are constructing. And so for me, a lot of what my own art historical research does is very different than just these ideas of sources or just plain this happened then and there. So I wanted to just briefly share some background as to what I do as an art historian. The stereotype might be that I stand in museums looking at art, but the reality is that as a medievalist, those images on the right more describe what my life looks like, AKA going into the middle of nowhere. This is central Anatolia, so middle of nowhere in Turkey, and going down a cliffside to find a fragment of a wall painting that is not even complete. And of course, my art historical training prepares me to understand that that fragment is an archangel. It is probably on the other side, was at one point matched by the figure of the Virgin Mary. It is an Annunciation scene, and I can usually fill in the gaps of what is not there. But what this means is that I'm constantly confronting archives that are fragmented, that are not really fully there, something which is really great with Disney, which for all it does in creating immersive spaces is also a very private company that also meticulously keeps archival documentation. So they're always ready to prove you wrong if need be. And so here, I wanted to just talk a little bit about what I do as an art historian. And so I just wanted to give you like this brief description of one of my book projects, which is essentially that I'm interested in how people used works of art. And that is to say how works of art were put to use in religious spaces, for example. So I'm showing you the Church of Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, from the mid-6th century, which was the imperial cathedral of the Byzantine Empire throughout its history well into the 15th century. And then on the bottom, I'm showing you a manuscript that probably was produced for this church in the mid-11th century and is filled with images, in particular, images that stress aspects of speaking and listening. Even the initials, so basically that opening E that you see there when the writing begins, it's the beginning of the Gospel of John, actually depicts a figure in the gesture of speech. And a lot of my research has focused on how these manuscripts were actually meant for their use in the performance of the Gospels, which is to say that they were acoustic texts, essentially. They were not just read, they were actually chanted. And so all those things that look like accents, only a few of them are accents. The rest of them are actually musical notation for how you would perform these texts. And so this would have been placed in a church like that, which would be filled with incense. There would be a series of icons moving around in unison. There would be people who were described in the period as crashing like waves onto the altar as they tried to get closer and closer. And there are all these resonances in the church, which by popping balloons, scholars have actually been able to determine the amount of echo time that would occur in this space. And I'm going through all this because I just want to say that how I look at medieval art is actually very similar to Disneyland. I'm looking at spaces that are immersive. They are trying to take you to another place and time. They are really trying to bring you out of sort of the mundane aspects of everyday life into these spaces that are very much themed, where there are rituals. The book would have been brought in to the church with the emperor and the patriarch. They would have greeted it as if it were Christ himself, and then entered to the church with chanting and hymns. The work would have been read with these wonderful enameled pointers to keep track of where they are in the text. And then they would have been read in particular from this very luxurious pulpit, what the Byzantines called an ambo, which was described as an island coming into an ocean in this space. And what is particularly great is that this is very much a theme space in the fact that the ancient and medieval world thought that marble was petrified water. And so they very much emphasized that in how they talked about pavements and flooring, with the idea that these were puddles of water, even in how they were laid out on the floor, as you see in the bottom image. With this real notion that the sound that you were hearing sounded like the waves of the ocean, that you were actually walking on a petrified ocean. So all these ideas come together from speaking to listening to these aquatic metaphors and get very nicely often depicted in art, as in this image where you have a church father writing a scroll that he would recite in church as a homily, and that scroll actually flows off of his lectern and becomes these flowing streams of water that the faithful do not listen to, but rather drink. And so these very conceptual ideas about how sound works, how notions of community work, are very much at hand in how I approach medieval art and how many of my colleagues also approach medieval art in our research and teaching. Which means that when I'm looking closely at spaces like bathrooms or the castle, which is more stereotypical, I'm really thinking about the ways in which visual analysis, close looking, opens up different routes for me to think about how these spaces work. And you can't think about how these spaces work without looking at the technologies behind them. And so one of the key things that I have my students do is, in one of the papers they have to write is a ride operation analysis paper. And they don't have to go to Disneyland to do it. They can go to the Irvine Spectrum, for example, which is a wonderful themed space, meticulously themed on the Alhambra, and which is there has a carousel and a Ferris wheel that they can look at the operations to understand that technology doesn't, A, always work the way we would like it to, and that B, technology, there's a lot you can learn by applying the same types of methods. And I particularly like this example of the guide rail for Alice in Wonderland because it's very visible in broad daylight, and it's a wonderful place to teach students about how rides work, safety systems, and just simple operations. I'm showing you for a comparison here on the left, an image from the pattern for the ride, which I teach alongside images so that students really get that feeling. They often read the patterns on their own, struggle, and are bored out of their minds, and then come to class and we walk through what they've been reading in those patterns. But one of the things I impress on them is that the closer you look at technology, which we often don't do, the more you begin to understand that, oh, that divot that we see on the left on the track, let me see, so like right there, that is actually a slot used to remove cars when they need to be repaired, carefully detailed in the pattern, but honestly something that you could stare at this for a long time and not really process as being meaningful or significant. And so it's being able to determine what's a significant detail and what is not that is so important. And that's what I love so much about teaching about Disneyland, that it's a place overfilled with stimulus, which means that to make sense of all that, you really need to find sort of this very Zen mentality of how to approach everything and begin to understand what is the sound of a brake and what is the sound of a child screaming, which is not always easy to do. And so then you eventually, by looking closely, you begin to get closer to these aha moments as you begin to do research, looking at the ways in which a pattern from 1959 is still, alive and well when you look at the undercarriage of one of these vehicles, and the way that you can begin to actually trace down sources. So just by looking at these tracks, it's very easy. I shouldn't say it's very easy. You're able to actually track down manufacturers of who made these tracks. And what is very interesting is that in doing this type of work, you begin to actually shed a very interesting light on Orange County and local manufacturing in a history that is way bigger than Disney. A history of industrial manufacturing in the area, a history, of course, of the space industry in the area that we've had for a very long time. And you can begin to understand how details of how these rides work can be captured, for example, even in this very simple insulator that divides portions of the track. The main reason why this is here is because it divides the track into zones so that every time a car leaves a segment of track, that portion of the track goes dark so that no other car could ever possibly go into that track and hit another car. So essentially, if a car were to enter that portion of dead track, it would actually just stop in the track and it would not reactivate until the car has left another future segment of the track. This is what we call zones. They were developed for railway systems in the 19th century and are applied essentially in every Disneyland ride and even the parade route as well. So in just teaching this little detail, I am able, over the course of a semester, over a quarter, to actually teach students about this longer history of the railway industry, why it was so important. We have so many great primary documents from the 19th century about Congress being like, hey, Europeans are doing this weird absolute blocking system to make safer railroad systems. Should we adopt it in the US? So there are these longer histories, of course, of the West and the railroad that can be brought into even the most mundane details of Disneyland rides, which for me very much should begin with students looking closely. And what I like about this is that as you look closely, you begin to see, how perhaps the numbers on a console begin to align with the brakes in the track. And for my students, the reason that I think this is important is because they're constantly surrounded by technology. And it's very easy to disregard technology and say, it doesn't matter, or it's too much out of my range of knowledge. But here there are histories of creativity and how these various systems were scaled up and down for an amusement park ride, and also the sheer ability to walk down the street and see those little black circles on the ground in the middle of the road in front of a stoplight and say, those are proximity induction sensors that when detecting the weight of the metal of a car will tell the light that it should change. I always remember that one of the most meaningful things when I learned, when I took AP Art History in high school, was that I could not watch anything without seeing Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns in every single thing. I remember watching Gilmore Girls and being like, I can't, there's too many of them. And that's sort of the experience that I really want to communicate to my students, because that will change the way you walk through the world. And I think that's with this topic of creativity, this is such a crucial aspect because of the fact that you can be creative on your own, but in order to use that creativity to make interventions in the world or in your own life, you really need to know what others are doing as well and be able to read this language just as an author would be able to read a book. And especially in our world where when I refer to technology, I don't just mean cell phones, I mean literally all of the infrastructure around us. I really want students to be able to gain a form of visual literacy to understand the types of spaces that they orbit around and walk through. And so technology in use, one of the other aspects that I definitely want to impress with students is that technology doesn't always behave the way we like it to. And I always use the example of the Jungle Cruise, which of course is on a track, it is moving along a set path, but of course there is that wonderful skipper that is constantly cracking jokes and subverting the sort of realms of what was intended with those various scenes and what is officially on their script and when they are going off script. This is something that Disney is very careful about creating operating guidelines or standard operating procedures for everything in the park. So you have these wonderful lines basically here on the right image telling you where in the Jungle Cruise you can speed up and where you cannot, or you will literally derail the boat, which does happen. And on the left from the same operating manual, there's this wonderful line which says, we definitely don't stick to this, which I really love because it's one of these moments that embodies the fact that even in a space that is so calculated, so regulated, so scripted, there is a lot of power for people themselves to subvert those things accordingly, to maybe poke fun a little bit about the inappropriate scenes in the Jungle Cruise and so forth. And so a lot of that for me is also understanding that, you can teach basic physics, you can teach basic technology through these examples, as, for example, looking at Splash Mountain and understanding that the #1 goal of Splash Mountain's vehicle design is not to splash. It's actually to reduce splashing so that the vehicle is not overflown with water. So the pattern that you're seeing on the right actually details the way in which the nose of the boat, which you're seeing in my slow motion video on the left, pushes the water away from riders as they are coming down. I'll see if I can play both of these at once. Let's see if I can actually pull this off. Let's leave them playing. What you're seeing here is actually 2 slow motion videos that I did of doing testing for Splash Mountain recently, which shows you the way that water behaves on the vehicles in a filled vehicle with test weights, as you see on the right, and how a vehicle behaves on the left when it is empty and devoid of guests. You can see it's taking a little bit longer to go through, and there is essentially absolutely no splash that is occurring, even though these boats are both moving at the same speed when they are dropped and everything else. And so being able to get students to look at these things, to understand that when they're doing research, either in the park or in other spaces for my class, they need to begin by observing what is there repeatedly to understand what is normal, what is different, what is unique. And that is how you really begin to comprehend the aspects that come into rides like this, where it's not just about creativity in the production of a unique space, it's also creativity in working responsibly and safely so that guests are not harmed in any capacity. For like the last few minutes, I just wanted to reflect also about some of the greatest benefits that I found in being able to work with Disneyland. One of my biggest struggles with students is teaching them that Wikipedia is not a source. I'm sure you all share this in some capacity. Wikipedia can be fine if you have high-level critical knowledge to judge sources and find out what's right and what's not, but it is not a good tool. And so one of the key things that I try to teach my students is how to distinguish between primary sources, that is a document coming from a historical period or specific site, and a secondary source, which is usually someone writing about this with knowledge and expertise, commenting on sources and so forth. So I very much like to use the example of, for example, a Disneyland operating procedures manual and a book written by a group of scholars on Disneyland. And what I love about this class is that while in a Byzantine art class, they're like, yeah, it's all the same to me. I don't know the difference between a medieval writer and a 20th century author. They're just as boring. With Disneyland, there's an inherent familiarity usually that students have that really allows them to approach this material with almost, I'm not going to say more nuance, but they're a lot more able to invest themselves in these distinctions, which I really appreciate. And also understanding that we have a lot of materials produced as secondary sources for Disneyland that are not really geared to an academic audience or written by historians, even if they are doing historical work. So for example, on the right, we have a very useful fan magazine called the E-Ticket that has these great interviews and studies of different rides with their history, written by a pair of brothers. And on the left, you have a former Imagineer who wrote a book on the Haunted Mansion's history. Both books that are not historical works in the sense that I have to produce historical works for a committee, but they are works geared toward fans that offer a lot of useful information. For example, cataloging a bunch of different ephemera that were produced by the parks around a particular attraction, or really reproducing a lot of great images that have perhaps not been seen before that they were able to get access to because of speaking with cast members, speaking with Imagineers, and so forth. So these are invaluable resources, even if the types of arguments and how they're constructed don't follow the historical models that I, as an educator at a university, am trying to get them to undertake. And teaching them about how to look for primary sources also means going into odd spaces. This is, for example, the Anaheim Heritage Center Archives, which has a great Disneyland collection that is open to the public and preserves a lot of interesting materials like these cast member magazines of the Disneyland line that shed invaluable resources as to life on the park. And so, for example, right now I'm curating an exhibition with a group of grad students on the types of cast member materials that we have in our own special collections at UCI. And we are going through all the Disneyland lines and understanding what life at the park was like and what working at the park was like. Because one of my key points that I like to stress is that it doesn't end with Imagineering, that ride operators, for example, have to write the operating procedures for the ride when it actually gets put to use. And so the creative process doesn't end when a ride opens, but it is a creative process that continues to evolve as the cast members, really, the people on the ground, begin to see what works and what doesn't in the park. And so that means that students working with these types of primary materials get to go through fact sheets and stuff like this from different periods and understand as well that depending on when this effective date was signed and so forth, it offers different types of information that you cannot go into the park today and think about as, yes, it is the same way. As an art historian, I always work with spaces that have been changed and changed over millennia. And for me, Disneyland is a very good place to have students confront this challenge because it is a place that is constantly changing. You can't even expect a curb to be there from one year to another. So it really requires you to be very critical about what you assume might have been there in the 70s, in the 80s, in 1955. And so leading students into these ideas of distinguishing between primary and secondary sources also means to encourage them to consider, for example, fan cultures, to understand the ways in which websites like this on the Haunted Mansion that orient themselves around a particular ride or attraction really are important cultural primary sources that you don't go for a sort of absolute definition of a historical fact about the Haunted Mansion. You go to it to understand how fans understand the Haunted Mansion, how they circulate it, and what is its physical footprint. And so I always like to end my class on this particular image, which is a blueprint of the Haunted Mansion. It is very careful. It shows every detail of the loading belt, the clocks, very key scenes, and also essentially every room and corridor there. This was produced by a fan. This object is not produced by Walt Disney Imagineering. It is a fan page that produces blueprints of Disney rides for fun. And so confronting students with this image really sort of like scrambles their brain and being like, oh, I can trust absolutely nothing. And I'm like, yes, my work here is done. In understanding what are the levels of production that the park encourages, not only in what it does, but to have creative processes like this that are akin to fan fiction. This is a form of fan fiction, just instead of writing a story about Kylo and Rey, you are writing about this attraction in various ways, both in text and of course in sketching out a blueprint. So with whatever time might be left, I'm happy to take questions from you all.